Rachel Myers never believed in curses. She lived alone in a quiet apartment, working late nights and spending most evenings scrolling through her phone. But everything changed the night she discovered a single silver button lying in the middle of her bedroom floor. By morning, more had appeared lined neatly across her dresser, her window, even her pillow. Rachel thought it was a prank, until she realized the buttons weren't just objects. They were watching her, and soon, they wanted to become part of her. The night felt strangely heavier than usual, as though the air in my room had thickened into something I could almost touch. I had been scrolling mindlessly through my phone, the glow of the screen the only light breaking the darkness, when the sound of the wind caught my attention. It wasn't the usual soft rush that brushed past the windows at night. This was different and even scraping, almost like a fingernail dragging slowly across glass. At first, I dismissed it, turning the volume up on a video, but the sound pressed itself into my awareness, growing louder, steadier, until it matched the rhythm of a deliberate knock. My chest tightened as I lowered the phone. The room fell into silence except for the rattle of the window pane. I told myself it was nothing but the storm outside, though I hadn't remembered seeing storm clouds earlier. Still, the wind explained everything, didn't it? I needed it too. I pulled the blanket tighter around me, hoping that by ignoring the sound it would eventually fade away. But the quiet brought no comfort. It left me with the sense that something was waiting, just beyond the glass, wanting me to notice. Finally, I shut my phone off and lay back, forcing my eyes to close. Sleep would put an end to this uneasiness. Yet even as my body stilled, my mind refused to settle. In the haze between wakefulness and sleep, I sensed something wrong in the room itself. The darkness didn't feel empty. My eyelids fluttered open, and I let my gaze drift lazily across the familiar shapes of my furniture. The faint outlines of shelves and dressers softened by the moonlight. Nothing unusual until I reached the closet. A shape darker than the dark stood there, its edges sharp against the faint gray around it. My breath froze in my throat. At first I thought it was nothing more than the bulk of my winter coats. But the longer I stared, the more I was sure it was separate from the hanging clothes. It was tall, unmoving, and unmistakably human in form. I told myself not to focus on it, that looking straight at it would make my imagination build something out of shadows. I shut my eyes tight, whispering silently in my head that it wasn't there, that I was only tired, but curiosity gnawed at me. Against every instinct I forced myself upright, my heart pounding so hard I swore the sound filled the room. Slowly I turned my head to the closet. The space was empty. Just the coats, the shoes, the same mess on the floor I'd been ignoring for weeks. A shaky breath left my chest, relief mixing with embarrassment at how badly I had frightened myself. I reached for my phone again, flipping it on for the comfort of the screen's glow. But the moment my eyes fell on the black reflection of the glass, every ounce of blood drained from my face. My phone showed more than just me. In its surface I could see the reflection of my bed, the dresser, the closet, and there clear as day was the shadowy figure, still standing where I had seen it moments before. I lifted my gaze instantly back to the closet, empty, back to the phone. There it was, unmoving. I couldn't breathe. My chest ached as I flipped the phone face down onto the blanket, refusing to see it again. I wanted to run, to leave the room entirely, but my body wouldn't obey. It was as if the very air weighed me down, forcing me to stay still. Minutes crawled by, every second louder than the one before. My eyes stayed wide open in the dark, unblinking, waiting for something to move, for some sign that I wasn't trapped in my own hallucination. Slowly, exhaustion overtook me, my eyelids drooping despite the terror in my chest. Just as I began slipping into restless sleep, a sound sliced through the silence. The closet door creaked, not wide, not fast, but slow. So slow it was worse than a sudden slam. The squeal of the hinges seemed to stretch endlessly through the dark. I didn't dare look. I shut my eyes and buried my face into the pillow, clutching the blanket as if it could save me. But even as I forced myself not to look, I knew with perfect clarity what had just happened. The closet door had opened by itself, and something inside was awake. Morning should have brought relief, but instead it left me unsettled in ways I couldn't explain. The sunlight poured through the window, illuminating every corner of my room. Nothing hid in the shadows anymore, and yet I couldn't shake the memory of that slow creak in the night. I didn't want to check the closet, but my eyes kept drifting there as if drawn against my will. Eventually, I forced myself to get up. My legs felt weak as I reached the door and nudged it open. The closet was quiet, ordinary, filled with the same clutter as always. For a moment I laughed at myself under my breath, embarrassed by my own paranoia. But then I noticed something on the floor that hadn't been there before. In the very center of the closet, as though carefully placed, lay a single silver button. It was old, the edges scratched, the surface dull. None of my clothes had buttons like that, and I couldn't imagine how it could have ended up there. I bent down, hesitated, then picked it up with 2 fingers. The instant I touched it, a faint whisper brushed against my ear, so close I swore I felt the breath against my skin. I spun around, but the room was empty. The button slipped from my hand and landed on the carpet with a soft thud. My heart pounded as I stared down at it. The whisper still echoed in my head, though I couldn't make out the words. It was like a voice half-formed cut off before I could understand it. Every instinct told me to throw the button away, so I snatched it up, crossed the room, and dropped it into the trash bin without another thought. For the rest of the morning, I tried to push the memory aside. I cleaned, scrolled through my phone, even turned the television on for background noise. But no matter what I did, a strange weight followed me. It was like a pressure on my chest, a heaviness that made every breath feel shallow. By evening, exhaustion set in. Though I hadn't done much, my mind replayed the whisper again and again, each time bending it into something more sinister. I thought about calling a friend, telling someone what had happened, but what would I even say? That a button whispered to me. No one would believe it, and the thought of hearing my own words spoken aloud made me feel insane. Instead, I stayed silent. Night fell quickly. My body longed for rest, but dread coiled around my thoughts. As I crawled back into bed, I forced myself to believe everything was normal again, just shadows and tricks of the mind. I switched off the lamp, pulled the blanket to my chin, and tried to focus on the rhythm of my breathing. For a while, it worked. My eyelids grew heavy, then something tugged me awake. I opened my eyes, disoriented, and scanned the room. At first nothing seemed out of place, but then my gaze drifted to the trash bin. My breath caught. It was empty. The button was gone. Panic surged through me as I scrambled to check the floor. Nothing. I pulled out the bin, tipped it over, shook it until every scrap of paper and dust spilled onto the carpet. No button. My pulse hammered in my ears as I checked the desk, the dresser, even under the bed. Gone. Completely gone. I tried to calm myself, to convince my mind that maybe I had imagined throwing it away. Maybe it hadn't been real in the first place. But even as I tried to believe that, I felt it. A chill against the back of my neck, a weight in the air that pressed close, as though the room itself were leaning in to watch me. Slowly, I turned my head toward the bed. There it was. On the pillow beside me lay the same silver button, perfectly centered, as if someone had placed it there with careful hands while I slept. The dull surface caught the faint glow of the moonlight, almost glimmering, almost alive. My stomach dropped and a sickening wave of fear rolled through me. I didn't touch it. I didn't move. I just stared at that impossible little object and realized something chilling. It hadn't disappeared, it had followed me. After that night, sleep stopped being a comfort. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt the room shift, as if something moved quietly in the dark just beyond where I dared to look. I told myself I could handle it, that it was only my imagination feeding itself. But that belief shattered the moment I noticed what had begun to happen with the button. It wasn't just one anymore. The first night, I found 3 of them on the dresser, lined up in a row like they had been set there deliberately. Each one was slightly different, one rusted, one cracked down the center, one gleaming faintly as if polished. I hadn't placed them there. I knew I hadn't. My hands shook as I dropped them all into the trash again, but the moment I turned back, I saw another button waiting on the windowsill, as though mocking me. The following night, I woke to find 5 arranged neatly in the sink, staring up at me like tiny, unblinking eyes. My stomach churned as I shoved them into a drawer, locking it shut, but that only made things worse. By the next evening, more appeared, not scattered, not random, but carefully placed. I found them in the hallway, the kitchen, even the bathroom. Some were balanced on shelves, others pressed into the carpet. They weren't just appearing, they were spreading. By the 4th night, I discovered them forming shapes. A spiral stretched across the floor of my bedroom, each button perfectly positioned, curling inward toward the base of my bed. I stood frozen, staring at it, unable to understand how it was possible. My knees threatened to give out, my throat dry as I whispered under my breath, telling myself to move, to do something, anything. I swept them up, every last one, and stuffed them into a trash bag. I dragged the bag outside, far from my house, and tossed it into a public dumpster. I should have felt relief, but when I returned to my room, the buttons were already back. They covered the dresser in neat rows, some stacked in piles, others laid flat like offerings. They were older now, dirtier, each one carrying the weight of time. I pressed my hand to my forehead, dizzy from fear, trying to steady myself. The room swayed, the walls seemed to lean closer, and the air turned thick with the metallic tang of rust. I couldn't escape it. That night, when exhaustion finally dragged me into uneasy sleep, I woke gasping to the sensation of weight pressing down on my chest. At first I thought it was sleep paralysis, my body pinned and helpless. But when I opened my eyes, I saw them. Buttons. Dozens of them. They covered my chest, my arms, even my face, cold circles pressing into my skin, balanced carefully as though placed one by one while I slept. I couldn't move without sending them rolling across the blanket. My breath came fast and shallow, each exhale trembling with panic. I swept them off me in a frenzy, scattering them onto the floor, their clinking sound filling the silence. I sat there shaking, unable to think, unable to convince myself that this was anything but real. For the rest of the night, I sat upright in bed with the light on, my eyes wide, unblinking, waiting for another impossible arrangement to appear. The following day I thought I could escape it by leaving the house. I spent hours outside, walking aimlessly, lingering in public places, just to avoid the suffocating weight of my bedroom. But when I returned home, dread froze me at the doorway. The buttons were everywhere. They blanketed the floor in careful patterns, lines, curves, spirals, all leading toward the closet. I stared at them, my mind screaming for me to run, to leave and never come back. Yet my body betrayed me, pulling me forward, one trembling step at a time. My eyes locked on the closet door. It was slightly open, just enough to reveal a sliver of blackness. And then I realized what the patterns meant. They weren't random. They were pointing me toward it, guiding me to the closet, inviting me inside. My knees locked, and I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat. I didn't open it. I couldn't. But as I turned away, forcing myself toward the bed, I caught sight of something far worse than the patterns on the floor. The mirror across the room reflected my face, pale and hollow. But behind me, just over my shoulder, the reflection showed the closet door wide open, and in the darkness inside, two faint circles glowed where eyes should have been. I stopped sleeping altogether. The thought of closing my eyes and waking up surrounded by buttons again was unbearable. My body dragged with exhaustion, my thoughts slurred, but I fought to stay awake by any means. Coffee, energy drinks, pacing in circles until my legs trembled. Every hour I stayed awake felt like I was resisting something that wanted to consume me. Yet the longer I forced my body to keep going, the less human I began to feel. The mirror told the truth before I wanted to admit it. My reflection was unrecognizable, eyes sunken and ringed in black, skin pale and damp with sweat. But worse than the changes to myself was what lingered in the reflection, the dark smudge. It was faint at first, easy to dismiss, but it never left, always behind me, always just out of reach. It never looked like anything clear, but the suggestion of a tall figure with shoulders bent and head tilted became harder to deny. The more I stared, the sharper it grew, as though my reflection was revealing something my eyes couldn't see on their own. The buttons weren't slowing down either. They multiplied until my house felt infested with them. Some were larger than my palm, their edges jagged as if cut from rusting metal. Others were so small they embedded themselves in the carpet, pricking at my bare feet whenever I stepped. I began finding them in places that were impossible: sealed drawers, the fridge, even floating in the toilet bowl. I couldn't escape their presence. They claimed every surface, every corner. The sound of them clicking against each other when I accidentally brushed past them haunted me worse than the silence. It was a little after midnight when I realized something had changed. I had been sitting on the couch, the television murmuring in the background, when static swallowed the channel. The picture broke apart into jagged gray and white, the sound hissing so loud it made my ears ring. I grabbed the remote, ready to switch it off, but before I could, the image shifted. My stomach turned. The screen showed a room, not just any room, my room. My bed was there, the dresser, the familiar curtain half drawn across the window. The perspective was wrong though. It wasn't from where I would normally look. The view came from inside the closet. I froze, the remote slipping from my hand onto the carpet. On the screen, the closet door framed the image, its edges jagged and black. At first I saw only my room, but then something leaned into view. A figure, tall and thin, with buttons sewn where its eyes should have been. They caught the light, glinting like dull coins, and even through the screen, I felt its gaze burrow into me. I scrambled to my feet, nearly tripping over the coffee table. My legs carried me down the hall and into the bedroom before I could think. The closet door stood shut. I yanked it open, expecting to find something waiting, but it was empty. Empty except for the rows of buttons covering the floor in neat piles, dozens of them, gleaming faintly in the dark. I stumbled back, slamming the door shut again, my chest heaving with ragged breaths. My mind spun. The television, I needed to see if the image was still there. I hurried back to the living room, my pulse hammering in my throat, but when I looked at the screen, it had returned to harmless static. No room, no figure, nothing. My relief was short-lived. On the couch, resting exactly where I had been sitting, lay a single button, but this one was different from all the others. It was larger, nearly the size of my palm, its metal surface scratched deeply with uneven lines. I bent closer, squinting, and the blood in my veins seemed to freeze solid. Words had been carved into the button's surface, crude and jagged. "Look behind you." Every nerve in my body screamed, but I didn't obey. My breath came fast, my muscles locked in place, my vision tunneling as I stared at those words. I didn't want to turn around. I couldn't. But the silence behind me grew heavier, denser, like something vast and waiting filled the air. My skin prickled as though unseen fingers hovered inches from my back. I stayed frozen, clutching the button in my shaking hand, my heart thundering so loud I could barely hear my own thoughts. But deep inside, I knew the truth. Whatever had been in the closet, whatever had filled the reflections and arranged the patterns, was standing right behind me now, and it was waiting for me to look. I don't remember how long I stood frozen in the living room that night, clutching the carved button in my hand. My heart refused to slow down, every beat echoing through my skull like the strike of a drum. The words etched into the metal burned into my vision, impossible to ignore. I tried to tell myself it was just another trick, another cruel arrangement designed to terrify me. But the silence behind me was unbearable. Every second stretched like an eternity, and the air thickened until I could feel it pressing down on my shoulders, urging me to turn. Finally, my body betrayed me. My neck stiffly twisted, inch by inch, until my gaze crept over my shoulder. The room was empty. No tall figure, no glowing buttons for eyes, only the pale glow of the television flickering in the corner. I let out a shaky breath, relief and dread tangled into one. But then the sound began, the slow creak of the closet door, far down the hallway. I didn't want to move, but my legs carried me forward as if pulled by invisible strings. The sound grew louder with each step, a long groan of hinges opening wider and wider. When I reached the bedroom, the door was already half open, darkness spilling out into the hall like ink. My throat tightened, every instinct screaming at me to run, but something stronger pulled me in. The air inside the closet was different, thicker, colder. It clung to my skin and burned with a metallic scent, sharp and sour, like rusting iron. And in the center of the dark, I saw it. The shadow stood tall, taller than any person I had ever seen, its body thin and rigid, its head bent at a crooked angle, as though it had been broken. Where its face should have been were two massive buttons, stitched deep into the skin with black thread that stretched taut, shining faintly in the dark. I stumbled backward, but the floor betrayed me. Buttons crunched beneath my feet, dozens of them scattered across the carpet, and as I looked around, I realized they weren't scattered at all. They covered the walls, the ceiling, the floor, every surface layered with them, and they pulsed, faintly, rhythmically, as though each one had a heartbeat. My vision blurred, panic boiling in my veins as I tried to escape, but the door slammed shut behind me with a force that shook the walls. I clawed at it, nails tearing against the wood, but it wouldn't budge. The closet was no longer a small space. It stretched on, deeper than it had ever been, swallowing me in its endless black. Cold hands touched my face. I flinched, but the grip was iron, fingers long and thin pressing firmly against my skin. Something sharp pierced me, not stabbing, but threading. I could feel it, a needle pulling through flesh, dragging coarse thread across my eyelids. I screamed, but the sound was muffled, swallowed by the walls around me. I tried to wrench free, but more hands closed around me, dozens of them, holding me down, stitching faster, binding me piece by piece. The pain was unbearable, but worse than the pain was the knowledge of what was happening. Each pull of the thread replaced the warmth of my eyes with something cold, hard, smooth. Buttons. They were sewing buttons into my flesh. My tears mixed with blood as I thrashed, but the process didn't stop. The last thing I saw before darkness swallowed me entirely were the gleaming circles of the Shadow's own button eyes staring down into mine. When I woke, I was lying on the floor in complete blackness. My breathing came ragged and uneven, and when I lifted my trembling hands to my face, my fingers brushed smooth, unfeeling surfaces where my eyes should have been. The realization sent a scream tearing from my throat, but no one heard it. The sound bounced back to me, muffled by walls that no longer belonged to my home. I wasn't in my bedroom anymore. I was inside the closet, but it wasn't a closet at all. Now it was endless, a corridor stretching forever into darkness, lined with buttons glowing faintly on the walls like eyes watching me. My feet sank into them with every step, the crunching echoing endlessly around me. The air was colder than death, and I knew with absolute certainty that I had crossed into a place I wasn't meant to be. I wasn't alone either. Shapes moved in the dark ahead of me, tall, crooked figures with buttons sewn where their eyes should have been. They turned their heads in unison, their bodies swaying, the threads on their faces glinting faintly as they regarded me. My knees buckled, my body shaking with terror. I wanted to close my eyes, to shut it out, but I couldn't anymore. I didn't have eyes to close. The figures stepped closer, and the buttons on the walls pulsed faster, beating like hundreds of hearts in unison. My hands clawed at my face, desperate to rip the buttons free, but they were sewn deep, unyielding. I screamed again, the sound tearing my throat raw, but it only echoed endlessly in the dark. And then I understood. The buttons weren't invading my world. They had been calling me into theirs all along. The shadow hadn't come from MIT, had remade me, drawn me in, pulled me across a boundary I hadn't known existed. I was no longer human. I was part of them. And somewhere, back in the world I had left behind, the closet door stood open, waiting for the next person to notice the shadows.